On the afternoon of June 12, 2009, a man stepped off a bus in the small coastal town of Sligo on the northwest coast of Ireland. He carried with him a purple travel bag, wore discreet but neat clothing, and walked with a firm step despite his age, which was around 65 to 70 years old. There was nothing apparently strange about his arrival. It was an ordinary Friday, with scattered tourists and residents going through their daily routines under the gray Atlantic sky. But this man was not an ordinary tourist. He left no trace of where he came from. He carried no identifiable luggage. And in the following days, he would execute one of the most meticulous and bewildering plans of deliberate disappearance that the Irish authorities had ever seen. Sligo is a modest town, with barely 20,000 inhabitants, known for its rugged landscapes, dramatic cliffs, and its connection to the poet William Butler Yeats, who spent much of his childhood in the region. It is a quiet place, where strangers are noticed but not interrogated, where life unfolds at a leisurely pace and Irish hospitality blends with natural discretion. For someone seeking to go unnoticed, Sligo offers the perfect balance between anonymity and functionality. Shortly after his arrival, the man headed to the Sligo City Hotel, a modest three-star establishment located in the city center, just steps from the bus station. At reception, he requested a single room. When registering, he provided a name, Peter Bergman. He said he was Austrian, although his accent did not quite match that nationality. He did not have his passport with him, he explained, but promised to bring it later. He paid in cash, in advance, for 3 nights. The hotel staff saw nothing alarming in this. They received the money, handed him the key to room 207, and the man went upstairs without making a sound. The receptionist on duty would later recall that the man was polite but distant. He asked no questions about the city. He did not request restaurant recommendations or tourist sites. He showed no interest in maps or informational brochures. He simply completed the registration, took his key, and disappeared up the stairs. His presence was so discreet it became almost invisible. During the following 4 days, Peter Bergman, if that was really his name, moved through the city of Sligo with almost surgical precision. Each of his actions was calculated. He made no phone calls. He did not use credit cards. He established no significant contact with anyone. He walked long distances, always alone, always observing. And little by little, he got rid of everything that could identify him. The city's security cameras captured fragments of his route. At that time, Sligo did not have a surveillance system as extensive as that of larger cities, but there were enough cameras at strategic points to allow a partial reconstruction of his movements. In one of them, he appears walking along Wine Street, Sligo's main street, with his purple bag in hand. Later, that same bag would be found empty in a trash bin near the hotel. In another recording, he is seen entering a second-hand shop. He bought used clothing. He paid in cash. He did not give his name. He left with a plastic bag and continued walking. The owner of the second-hand shop would later remember that the man had been extremely methodical in his selection. He was not looking for anything in particular, but he examined each garment carefully before taking it. He chose practical, functional clothing with no distinctive style. Dark pants, plain shirts, basic underwear. Everything in neutral tones. Everything anonymous. When he paid, he did so with exact bills, as if he had calculated the amount in advance. He did not wait for change. He simply left. On another occasion, he was seen depositing objects in different trash bins distributed throughout the city. Witnesses would later remember seeing him put in clothing, labels, wrappers, papers, everything that could reveal his origin. He did it calmly, without haste, without apparent nervousness, like someone completing a necessary task. He did not look around to check if he was being watched. He was not trying to hide. He simply executed his plan with the same naturalness with which someone else would throw away an old newspaper. One of the most intriguing aspects of his behavior was the geographic distribution of these disposals. He did not always use the same bin. He did not follow a predictable route. Each day, he chose different points in the city to get rid of his belongings, as if he were deliberately avoiding anyone being able to trace a pattern. One day, he left something in the north of the city, the next day in the south. A bin by the port, another near the train station, never the same place twice. On Saturday, June 13th, one day after his arrival, Peter Bergman walked to Ross's Point Beach, or about 8 kilometers northwest of downtown Sligo. It is a beautiful place, quiet, battered by the Atlantic wind. The peninsula juts into the ocean like a finger pointing toward infinity, flanked by sand dunes, wild grass, and stones polished by centuries of tides. From there you can see the majestic Ben Bulben, the flat-topped mountain that dominates the landscape and that the poet Yeats immortalized in his verses. It is a place of melancholic beauty, where sky and sea merge on the horizon. He spent several hours there. Some witnesses saw him sitting on the rocks, looking at the sea. He spoke to no one. He took no photographs. He simply observed. An elderly man walking his dog that afternoon would remember seeing him sitting in the same position for more than 2 hours, completely motionless, like a statue looking toward the ocean. When the walker returned along the same path an hour later, the man was still there. What was he thinking as he looked at the sea? Did he remember something? Someone? Or did he simply let the roar of the waves fill the emptiness of his mind? We will never know. But there is something in that image, a man sitting alone facing the infinite Atlantic, that suggests a farewell. Not to a place, but to something greater, perhaps to life itself. He returned to the hotel that night. The staff would remember that he arrived late, after 10 o'clock at night. He went straight to his room without stopping at reception. He did not ask for anything. He said nothing. The next day, Sunday, June 14th, he went out again. He walked toward the coast again. This time he chose another point on the beach. He stayed there for hours. The hotel staff would later comment that each time he returned, he seemed thinner, paler, more tired. But he never asked for help. He never showed signs of distress, only silence. During that Sunday, a couple of British tourists vacationing in Sligo saw him walking alone along the shore. They would later tell police that he had caught their attention because he was walking very slowly, as if each step cost him enormous effort. They thought about approaching to ask if he was all right, but something in his body language and the way he kept his gaze fixed on the horizon made them think he preferred to be alone. So they continued on their way and did not think of him again until they saw his photograph on the news a few days later. Monday, June 15th, was his last day alive. That morning, he left the hotel early. Although he was not carrying the purple bag, he was carrying almost nothing. He wore light clothing, despite the fact that the weather in Sligo in June can be cool and windy. He walked again toward Ross's Point. This time, he did not return. The next day, Tuesday, June 16, 2009, a walker traversing Ross's Point Beach found a man's body on the shore. He lay on his back, dressed in light clothing, soaked with salt water. There were no signs of violence, no visible wounds, no blood. Only an elderly man, alone, dead on the Irish coast. The discovery occurred around 8 o'clock in the morning. The walker, a local resident who usually walked the beach every morning before work, saw something on the shore that he initially thought was abandoned clothing or debris, washed up by the tide. As he approached, he realized with horror that it was a human body. He immediately called emergency services. The Irish police, known as An Garda Síochána, were notified immediately. Officers cordoned off the area and began preliminary investigations. They examined the body in search of identification. They found nothing. No documents, no wallet, no cards, no cell phone, no keys. Nothing that could say who this man was. The clothing he was wearing had been stripped of all labels. The pants, the shirt, the underwear, all the manufacturer's marks had been cut off with precision. Even the shoes had been modified to eliminate any trace of the place of purchase. The cuts were clean, made with sharp scissors probably shortly before his death. It was evident that this was not an accident. Someone had taken extreme measures to erase his identity. The pockets were completely empty. There were no coins, no receipts, no small personal objects that most people carry without even realizing it. Not a piece of paper with a scribbled address. Not a bus ticket, not a candy wrapper. Nothing. It was as if he had methodically emptied each pocket, each fold of his clothing, making sure that absolutely no clue remained. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was drowning, but the circumstances were ambiguous. There were no signs of struggle, no traces of drugs or alcohol in the body. The toxicology analysis came back negative. There was no evidence that he had been forced into the water, nor were there clear signs of violent suicide. There were no nearby rocks suggesting he had thrown himself from a height. There were no marks on his neck indicating prior hanging. Simply, he had drowned. Analysis of the body's condition suggested he had been in the water between 12 and 24 hours before being found. The temperature of the Atlantic water at that time of year is around 12 or 13 degrees Celsius, cold enough to cause hypothermia in less than an hour. If he had entered the water on Monday afternoon or evening, death would have been relatively quick. The autopsy revealed that the man had suffered from advanced stage prostate cancer, as well as chronic heart problems. He was seriously ill. Doctors estimated that without treatment, he would have had months of life left, perhaps weeks. The cancer had spread beyond the prostate, affecting the pelvic bones and possibly other organs. He would have experienced considerable pain, probably increasing day by day. But there were no signs that he was receiving medical care. He carried no medications. There were no prescriptions, nothing. The pathologist also noted signs of recent malnutrition. The man had lost weight significantly in the weeks or months prior to his death. His body mass index was below normal for someone of his height and build. This was consistent with someone suffering from a terminal illness and who perhaps had stopped eating properly, either from lack of appetite caused by the disease or by deliberate decision. The police then began to trace his previous movements. Through Sligo's security cameras, they managed to partially reconstruct his itinerary. They identified the hotel where he had stayed. They spoke with the staff. They retrieved the registration record. Peter Bergman, supposedly from Austrian 4, Vienna, Austria. But when the authorities contacted the Austrian police, they discovered that this address did not exist. There was no street called Osterlin in Vienna. There was no Peter Bergman registered in Vienna with those characteristics, nor in the rest of Austria. The address was completely fictitious. Not a transcription error, not an incorrect number, but a total invention. And the name, Peter Bergman, although common in German-speaking countries, did not correspond to any missing person in the police records of Austria, Germany, Switzerland, or any other European country. The phone number he had provided when registering at the hotel also turned out to be false. The area code did not correspond to any region of Austria. When police tried to call the number, they discovered it did not exist. It was invented data, like everything else, or every piece of information he had provided about his identity was a carefully constructed lie. The Irish police expanded the search. They reviewed recordings from the city's traffic cameras. They found several images of the man walking through different streets, always alone, always with the same purple bag. In one of the clearest recordings, he is seen stopping in front of a trash bin, opening his bag, taking out several items of clothing, and depositing them inside. Then he closes the lid and continues walking. The movement is fluid, natural, without hesitation, like someone posting a letter in a mailbox. Officers inspected those bins. They recovered several garments that matched those he had bought in local shops. All had been stripped of their labels. They also found wrappers from pain medications, all empty, without identifiable marks. And fragments of paper, some burned, others torn into pieces so small that it was impossible to reconstruct their content. Forensic analysis of these fragments revealed that some had been handwritten documents, possibly letters or personal notes. Others appeared to be receipts or transportation tickets. But all had been destroyed so meticulously that recovering useful information was impossible. Some fragments showed signs of having been partially burned before being torn, a double layer of destruction that guaranteed total elimination of the information. One of the most disturbing findings was a postcard he had bought at a Sligo souvenir shop. The postcard showed an image of the Irish coast, specifically Ross's Point Beach. He had paid for it in cash, like everything else. But he never sent it, and they found it in the trash, blank with nothing written, as if he had considered the idea of communicating with someone and then decided not to. The shopkeeper who sold him the postcard vaguely remembered the transaction. She said the man had spent several minutes choosing between different postcards, examining each one carefully before deciding on the Ross's Point image. He had paid the exact amount and left without saying anything beyond a polite thank you. nothing that distinguished him from any other tourist buying a souvenir. The Irish authorities published photographs of the deceased man in national and international media. They requested help from the public. They contacted Interpol. They sent DNA samples to databases throughout Europe. They compared his fingerprints with police records from Austria, Germany, Switzerland, or the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Scandinavia. Nothing. The published photographs showed a man with a thin face, with features that could be considered Central European. Gray hair, slightly disheveled, pale skin. Eyes that, in the security camera images, seemed tired, as if carrying the weight of years of unrevealed experiences. It was not a particularly distinctive face. It was the type of face that could get lost in a crowd, that could belong to a retired professor, a retired accountant, an office worker. Ordinary in every way, except in the circumstances of his death. Despite the wide dissemination of the images, no one came forward to identify him. No one recognized him. No one claimed him. In an era where millions of people share their lives on social media, where photographs circulate instantly around the world, or where facial recognition algorithms can identify someone among millions, this man remained completely anonymous. Analysis of the hair and isotopes present in his teeth revealed that he had probably grown up in Central Europe, possibly in Germany or neighboring regions. The type of water he had consumed during his childhood and adolescence matched that geographic area. The strontium and oxygen isotopes in the dental enamel, which formed during the first years of life and remain unchanged thereafter, pointed to a specific region of Central Europe, probably within a radius of several hundred kilometers that would include parts of Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, or Poland. But that was not enough to identify him. Central Europe is home to tens of millions of people. Without a real name, without dental records to compare, without fingerprints matching any database, that geographic information was simply a scientific curiosity, not a useful clue. The accent he had used when speaking with hotel staff was described as foreign, possibly German or Austrian, but not completely consistent. Some employees said his English was good but formal, as if he had learned it in an academic or professional context. Others noted small inconsistencies in his pronunciation, as if he were deliberately modulating his way of speaking. A linguist consulted by the police analyzed the few words that had been recorded from the man in interactions with hotel staff and shops. His conclusion was intriguing. The accent seemed to be genuinely German or Austrian, but there were certain nuances suggesting he might have lived in different countries for extended periods. The man's English showed British rather than American influences, which suggested he had learned it in a European context, possibly in the German or Austrian educational system of the mid-20th century. There was speculation about whether he was a man with intelligence training. His methodical behavior, his ability to avoid cameras when possible, his knowledge of how to eliminate forensic traces, all pointed to someone with experience in covert operations. The way he had planned every detail, the manner in which he had anticipated every possible avenue of identification and systematically blocked it, suggested a level of sophistication that went beyond what an ordinary person could achieve. Security experts who analyzed the case pointed out several aspects that were consistent with professional intelligence training. The elimination of all clothing labels was not something that would occur to someone without specific training. Most people do not think of clothing labels as vectors of identification. But for someone trained in clandestine operations, every detail counts. A label can reveal where clothes were purchased, which can narrow the geographic search. A particular style of stitching can indicate a country of origin. Even the type of thread used can provide clues. The geographic distribution of his disposals also showed sophistication. He did not throw everything in one place, which would have facilitated reconstruction of his complete inventory of belongings. Instead, he dispersed his possessions throughout the city, making the investigators' task difficult. This is a classic counter-surveillance tactic. Never leave a complete trail in one place. But there was no proof, only conjecture. And the intelligence agencies of several European countries, consulted discreetly by Interpol, denied having knowledge of any missing agent matching the profile. Another hypothesis suggested he might have been a criminal fleeing from his past. Someone who had committed a serious crime decades ago and who, facing a terminal illness, decided to die in anonymity to prevent his family or his victims from knowing his fate. This theory gained some traction in certain circles because it explained both the secrecy and the terminal illness. A guilty man, facing his mortality, might want to die without the additional weight of justice or public judgment. Our investigators reviewed unsolved cases of serious crimes in Central Europe dating back to the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. They looked for patterns that might match mysterious disappearances, unsolved murders, major robberies. But again, without a real identity to investigate, without fingerprints to compare with crime scenes, the search was fruitless. It was also suggested that he might simply have been a lonely man, sick, without family, who preferred to die away from any human connection. Someone who, for personal reasons, chose to disappear without leaving a trace. Perhaps he had lived a life marked by pain, loss, or shame, and considered that the best way to end it was to do so in absolute solitude, without anyone mourning his death or investigating his life. This theory, although simpler, resonated with a certain existential truth. There are people who reach the end of their lives feeling completely disconnected from the world. Without close family, without intimate friends, without significant ties that bind them to society. For someone in that situation, especially facing a painful mental illness, the idea of simply disappearing might have a strange appeal. Not as an act of desperation, but as a deliberate choice of final autonomy. If no one really knows you, if no one depends on you, if your existence leaves no void in anyone's life, why not choose how and where it ends? The investigators also considered the possibility that he had been fleeing from a criminal network or dangerous organization. That his false identity and meticulous erasure of traces were protective measures, not concealment. Perhaps he had witnessed something he should not have seen, or knew something he should not have known, and the only way to protect himself, even in death, was to ensure that no one could trace him. But if that was the case, no one came looking for him. No one claimed the body. No one asked about him. If he had enemies pursuing him, apparently they lost his trail, or perhaps his death solved the problem he represented for them. The case of Peter Bergman attracted the attention of journalists from around the world. Documentaries, articles, podcasts, online forums, all tried to unravel the mystery. The story had all the elements that capture public imagination: mystery, death, anonymity, and unanswered questions. It was the type of case that invited speculation, that allowed each person to project their own theories and narratives. In 2010, the Irish television channel RTE produced a documentary titled The Last Mystery of Peter Bergman. The program included dramatic recreations of his last days, interviews with hotel staff, testimonies from the police officers who investigated the case, and analysis by forensic identification experts. The documentary was watched by hundreds of thousands of people in Ireland and was subsequently distributed internationally. The impact was immediate. Dozens of theories emerged on internet forums. Some claimed to recognize the man, but each supposed identification turned out to be wrong. Others proposed elaborate conspiracies involving everything from the Russian mafia to secret government experiments. Each theory was more fantastic than the last, but none had solid foundation. Some amateur investigators traced historical records looking for matches. Others analyzed every frame of security footage, looking for details that police might have missed. One particularly dedicated group created a website where they cataloged every known piece of evidence, every testimony, every photograph. The site became a meeting point for people fascinated by the case, a place where theories could be discussed and debated ad infinitum. A detailed analysis of his behavior at the hotel revealed that he never used the room phone. Hotel records showed no outgoing calls from room 207 during his stay. He never turned on the television. The cleaning staff noticed that the television was in the same position every day, with no signs of having been used. He never requested cleaning service. In fact, he hung the "Do Not Disturb" sign on his door every day and left it there throughout his stay. The hotel staff remembered that he was extremely discreet. He left early in the morning, generally before 8 o'clock, and returned late at night, after 10 o'clock. He did not have breakfast at the hotel. He did not dine at the restaurant. He only paid, slept, and left. When the cleaning staff finally entered the room after his death, they found it was practically untouched. The bed had been used, but Everything else remained exactly as the hotel had left it. There were no personal objects. There was no trash in the bins. It was as if no one had really lived there. One of the security cameras captured him shopping at a convenience store. He purchased bottled water, bread, some fruit. He paid in cash. He did not speak to the cashier beyond what was necessary. The entire transaction lasted less than 2 minutes. The cashier remembered him vaguely, only because the man had been so quiet and efficient that he had stood out precisely by not standing out. On another occasion, he was seen entering a pharmacy. It is not known exactly what he bought, but he left with a small paper bag that was later found empty in the trash. The pharmacist on duty that day did not remember the specific transaction, which suggests it was a routine purchase, probably over-the-counter pain relievers. He had not purchased prescription medications, which would have left a record and required identification. Witnesses who saw him at Ross's Point during those days described a calm man, almost serene. He did not seem distressed. He did not seem lost, or he was simply there, sitting on the rocks, looking at the horizon. Some said he seemed to be saying goodbye. Others that he seemed to be waiting for something. A local woman walking her children on the beach on Sunday saw him from a distance. She would later say that what caught her attention was his absolute stillness. Most people who sit on the beach do something, she explained to police. They read a book, look at their phone, eat something, talk to someone. But he was just there, looking. He didn't even seem to blink. It was almost like a statue. Analysis of the tides and ocean currents suggested that the body had not been carried from far away. The pattern of currents at Ross's Point is complex, influenced by both Atlantic tides and the configuration of the bay. Oceanography experts consulted determined that, based on the location where the body was found and the tide conditions on the relevant days, the man had probably entered the water at a point not far from where he was discovered. He had entered the water in the vicinity of where he was found. There were no signs that he had tried to swim. There were no resistance marks on the body suggesting he had struggled against the waves. The lungs contained salt water, confirming he had been alive when he entered the water, and that death was by drowning, not by some other cause preceding immersion. But there was no way to know if he had deliberately walked into the sea or if he had simply let himself be carried by the waves. The circumstances pointed to suicide, but in the absence of a note or clear statement of intent, the medical examiner could not make that determination with absolute certainty. Officially, the cause of death was recorded as drowning, with undetermined circumstances. No suicide note was ever found. No farewell letter was ever found. No explanation was ever found. Only silence. This silence, in many ways, was the most defining characteristic of the case. In a society where most people leave extensive digital traces, where lives are obsessively documented in photographs and social media posts, where communication is instantaneous and constant, this man had managed to create a total void of information. In 2010, 1 year after his death, the Irish authorities made the decision to bury the man known as Peter Bergman in the Sligo Cemetery. There were no family members present. There was no formal religious ceremony. Only a small group of local officials, some Sligo residents who had been moved by the story, and the local parish priest, Father Eamon Kelly, who offered a few brief words about human dignity and the mystery of existence. Father Kelly would later say it had been one of the saddest funerals he had presided over. Normally, when you bury someone, he explained, there are stories. People share memories. They talk about who that person was, what mattered to them, how they lived. But with this man, there was nothing. Only questions. It was like burying an unanswered question. The headstone was placed with a simple inscription: Peter Bergman, died June 16, 2009. Below, a phrase in Irish that translates as Ardes de go raib a ana, which means, may his soul be at the right hand of God. It is an anonymous grave for an anonymous man. A final place for someone who worked tirelessly to ensure no one knew who he was. The funeral was paid for by County Sligo. There was no known estate, no family to claim the body, no private funds available. So the Irish state assumed the cost, a final act of bureaucratic compassion toward a complete stranger. The years passed, and the case remained open. From time to time, a new lead would emerge. Someone claimed to have recognized the man in an old photograph. Someone else suggested a connection with an unsolved case in Eastern Europe. But none of these leads led to anything concrete. In 2011, a woman from Germany contacted the Irish police claiming that the man in the photographs resembled her uncle, who had disappeared in the 1990s. A DNA comparison was arranged. The results were negative. It was not her uncle. In 2012, a man in Austria suggested he might be a former co-worker who had left his job abruptly years before. Again, the DNA comparison proved negative. These false alarms became a pattern. Every few months, someone believed they recognized him. Each time, tests proved they were wrong. The face in the photographs was generic enough to evoke memories of many different people, but specific enough not to exactly match any. In 2014, an Irish documentary revisited the case. They interviewed the investigators who worked on it, the hotel staff, the witnesses who had seen him on the beach. All agreed on the same thing. They had never seen anything like it. That man's determination to erase his identity was unusual, almost professional. And yet, there was nothing to indicate violence, criminality, or danger. He's just a sick man who chose to die without a name. Inspector John O'Reilly, who had led the initial investigation, was interviewed extensively for the documentary. He was close to retirement by then, and the case of Peter Bergman had clearly affected him deeply. "I've worked on hundreds of cases," he said in the interview. "I've seen terrible things. But there's something about this case that haunts me. It's not the violence or the horror. It's the emptiness. It's like this man decided to erase himself from existence, and he almost completely succeeded. That troubles me in a way I can't fully explain." The documentary posed a disturbing question. Why would someone do such a thing? What leads a person to deliberately eliminate all connection with their past, with their family, with their country, with their name? What kind of pain? What kind of guilt? What kind of fear justifies such an act? Some psychologists consulted suggested he might have suffered profound trauma. Perhaps he had lost his family in tragic circumstances. Perhaps he had made mistakes he could not forgive himself for. Perhaps he had simply lived a life he considered unworthy of being remembered. Dr. Michael Brennan, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and grief, offered a particularly poignant perspective. "Some people reach a point in their lives where they feel their identity is more of a burden than an asset," he explained. "They may have experienced losses so devastating that their sense of who they are becomes unbearable. In extreme cases, especially when combined with a terminal illness, they may decide that the only way to free themselves is to eliminate that identity completely. It's not that they necessarily want to die, though that's part of it. It's that they want to stop being who they've been." Other experts suggested it might have been an act of absolute control. That, facing a terminal illness that was taking away control over his body, he decided to exercise total control over his death. He chose the place. He chose the time. He chose to disappear. It was his last decision, made with full consciousness and executed with millimetric precision. Dr. Sarah O'Connor, a specialist in thanatology and death studies, offered another interpretation. "In a culture where death has been so medicalized, where we typically die in hospitals surrounded by strangers and machines, there was something almost romantic about what this man did. He chose to die on his own terms, in a beautiful place, with complete dignity and privacy. From that perspective, it's not a tragedy but a form of empowerment." In the following years, independent investigators continued working on the case. Some traced migratory records of Central Europe, looking for men of similar age who had disappeared in the dates prior to June 2009. The task was monumental. Central Europe is home to millions of people, and movement records are not perfectly integrated between countries. A person could disappear from one country without another country recording their arrival, especially before European Union border controls became more rigorous. Others analyzed flight and train records, attempting to determine how he had arrived in Ireland. But the data was incomplete, the clues diffuse, and the trail deliberately cold. Without a real name to search for, without a real departure date, without a confirmed country of origin, the search was like trying to find a needle in a continent-sized haystack. One particularly exhaustive investigation was carried out by a German journalist named Klaus Miller. who dedicated more than 2 years to tracing possible connections. Mueller theorized that the man might have traveled to Ireland from Great Britain, possibly by ferry from Liverpool or Holyhead. He reviewed ferry passenger records from the weeks prior to his appearance in Sligo, but without a real name or clear photograph to compare, the search was fruitless. Mueller also investigated the possibility that the man had traveled directly from continental Europe, perhaps by ferry from France. Again, without identifiable data, he could not establish a definitive connection. And what he did discover was that several ferry companies did not require passports for travel within the European Union in 2009, which meant someone could have traveled without leaving an official identification record. One of the most elaborate theories suggested that Peter Bergman might have been a former intelligence officer from East Germany, the former GDR, someone who had worked for the Stasi, and who, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, had lived under a false identity to avoid reprisals. Upon discovering he had terminal cancer 20 years later, he would have decided to disappear completely before dying, to protect his loved ones or to prevent his past from coming to light. This hypothesis had a certain logic. Former intelligence agents were trained to operate under false identities, to move without leaving traces, to destroy documents and eliminate evidence. The profile fit. The age was right. Someone who had worked for the Stasi in the 1970s and 1980s would be between 60 and 70 years old in 2009. The technical knowledge of counter-surveillance was consistent with intelligence training. And the motivation, the desire to die without his true identity being revealed, made sense for someone with a controversial past. But there was no proof. Stasi databases had been partially destroyed during the fall of the East German regime. Many files were burned by agents trying to protect their identities and those of their informants. The files that survived were in a state of chaos, with fragmented documents and incomplete records. Verifying whether a specific individual had worked for the Stasi, without even knowing their real name, it proved almost impossible. Moreover, the German authorities managing the Stasi archives are extremely cautious about releasing information, especially about individuals who might still be alive, or whose families might be affected. Without a specific request with a real name and convincing evidence of relevance, they were unwilling to open their archives for an exploratory search. Another line of investigation focused on the possibility that he had been a victim of an identity trafficking network, that someone else had used his real identity while he lived under a false name, and that upon discovering his illness, he decided to die without revealing the truth so as not to compromise others. This theory arose from documented cases in Eastern Europe where criminal networks had trafficked identities, selling documents of real people to those who needed to disappear. But again, it was speculation without solid foundation. There was no evidence that Peter Bergman had been part of such a network. There were no signs of criminal activity. There were no obvious connections to organized crime, just a man who died alone on an Irish beach. It was also considered that he might have been a protected witness who decided to break with his new identity. Someone who had cooperated with authorities in an important criminal case, received a new identity, but who at the end of his life chose to die without it. Perhaps he had testified against a dangerous organization decades earlier, had lived under protection since then, and upon discovering he had terminal cancer, decided he preferred to die as who he really was, or not as the person the witness protection program had created. However, no witness protection program in Europe reported the disappearance of anyone matching his description. The Irish authorities discreetly contacted their counterparts in several European countries, asking if they had any missing protected witnesses. All responded negatively. What is known with certainty is this. A man arrived in Sligo on June 12, 2009. He paid cash for everything. He provided false information. He systematically eliminated any trace of his identity. He walked toward the sea. And he died. These are the irrefutable facts, confirmed by physical evidence, multiple testimonies, and official records. Everything else, all speculation about who he was, where he came from, why he did what he did, remains in the realm of conjecture. When there is no evidence that anyone was looking for him, neither before nor after his death. There are no missing persons reports matching his description. There are no family members who have filed complaints. There are no employers who have reported the unexplained absence of an employee. It is as if he had existed in a vacuum, disconnected from all the social systems that normally track human existence. There is no evidence that he was fleeing from anything specific. There are no signs of paranoia. There is no erratic behavior suggesting he was being pursued. His movements, although methodical and clearly designed to eliminate traces, showed no urgency or fear. He took his time. He was deliberate. He was calm. There is no evidence that he left behind a family waiting for him. No one claimed the body. No one asked about him. When his photograph was published in newspapers across Europe, when his story was told on television programs in multiple languages, no one came forward. Not a distant cousin, not a former co-worker, not a neighbor who remembered him. Absolutely no one. Only the void. This void is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case. It is not that the man died. Death is universal, inevitable. It is that he died without leaving any echo in the world. Like a stone thrown into an infinitely deep lake, which sinks without creating even a ripple on the surface. The case of Peter Bergman is a disturbing reminder of how fragile our identity is. We live in an era of constant surveillance, of interconnected databases, of digital records that track us from birth to death. Our lives leave extensive digital footprints. Bank transactions, social media posts, medical records, employment histories, travel data, online purchases. We exist in multiple databases simultaneously, our identities fragmented and replicated on servers around the world. And yet, a man managed to live his last days without anyone knowing who he was. He died without a name. He was buried without a history. And he disappeared from existence as if he had never existed. This raises disturbing questions about the very nature of identity. What does it mean to exist? Is it enough to have a physical body? Or do we also need a name, a history, connections with others? When Peter Bergman, or whatever his real name was, eliminated all the markers of his identity, did he cease to exist in some fundamental sense, even before dying physically? Philosophers have debated for centuries about the nature of the self and identity. Are we the sum of our memories? Are we defined by our relationships with others? Are we our names, our nationalities, our professions? Or is there something more fundamental, some inner essence that exists independently of all these external markers? Peter Bergman seems to have answered these questions in a radical way. By deliberately eliminating all external markers of his identity, he suggested that he considered his true self could exist and die without them. That everything else, the name, the passport, the personal history, were dispensable accessories. The Irish authorities keep the case open. Technically, it remains an unidentified death. The file remains in the An Garda Síochána records, waiting for the day when perhaps someone will come forward with information. But with the passage of years, the possibilities of solving it become increasingly remote. Witnesses age. The hotel staff who served him are now dispersed, some retired, some who have left the hotel business. Their memories fade, mixing with thousands of other guests who have passed through the hotel in the intervening years. Records are lost, computer systems are updated, and sometimes in data migration, information is lost or corrupted. Video recordings from 2009 are of lower quality than current ones, and with each passing year, they become more difficult to analyze with new technologies. Collective memory fades. In 2009, the case made national headlines in Ireland and international headlines in Europe. But with each passing year, other stories occupy the headlines. Other mysteries capture public imagination. The case of Peter Bergman gradually becomes a footnote, an interesting but non-urgent mystery. And the man who chose to call himself Peter Bergman remains in his anonymous grave, guarding a secret he took with him to the ocean. There is something deeply disturbing about the idea that someone can disappear like this. Not in the midst of a catastrophe, where bodies are consumed by fire or buried under rubble. Not in a violent crime, where victims are deliberately hidden by their killers, but simply because he decided to do so. Because he chose to erase every trace, every link, every name. Because he preferred to die alone rather than be found. What did he experience in his last hours? This question haunts everyone who has studied the case. On Monday, June 15th, or when he walked for the last time toward Ross's Point, what was going through his mind? Did he feel fear? The water of the Atlantic in June is brutally cold. Entering it, knowing you would not come out, requires extraordinary determination. The body instinctively fights against hypothermia and drowning. Every cell screams for survival. Did he have to force himself to continue? Or had he reached a state of acceptance so deep that fear simply did not exist? Did he feel peace? Some who have survived drowning attempts describe a moment of strange calm before losing consciousness, a sensation of surrendering to the inevitable. Did he experience that? Was there a moment of final serenity as the cold water enveloped him? Did he feel regret? In those final moments of consciousness, did he think about the decisions that had brought him to that point? Did he wish he had taken a different path? Or was he convinced until the end that this was the only way, the right way? Did he think of someone? Despite all his efforts to erase his past, did a face emerge in his mind? A voice? A memory? Was there someone he loved? Someone he missed? Someone he was silently saying goodbye to? Did he remember something? A childhood somewhere in Central Europe? Moments of happiness before whatever led him to this lonely end? Or had he managed, through pure force of will, to empty his mind of everything except the immediate task? We will never know. These questions will remain unanswered forever. And perhaps that is exactly what he wanted. Perhaps the entire plan, the meticulous elimination of every trace of identity, was precisely to ensure that no one could answer these questions. That his final thoughts, his final feelings, his final reasons died with him. Today, more than 15 years after his death, the case of Peter Bergman remains one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in modern Irish history. Not because of the brutality of a crime, because there was no crime. Not because of the complexity of the investigation, because the investigation was thorough and professional, but because of the terrifying simplicity of what it represents. A man who decided that his identity did not deserve to survive his body. In a sense, he accomplished what very few people accomplish: total control over his own narrative. In an age where our lives are increasingly public, where privacy is constantly eroded, where every action leaves a permanent digital footprint, this man executed an act of absolute privacy. He not only died in private, but he ensured that his entire life remained private after his death. In the age of information, of social media, of permanent digital footprint, Peter Bergman demonstrated that it is still possible to disappear. That it is still possible to live and die without anyone really knowing who you were. That identity, in the end, is something as fragile as a label cut from a shirt, something that can be eliminated, discarded, forgotten. But there is a tragic irony in this. By trying to disappear completely, Peter Bergman became something memorable. His effort not to be remembered is precisely what makes him unforgettable. If he had died with a real name, with a known history, he would have been one more statistic. An elderly man with cancer who drowned. Sad, but not particularly notable. Instead, by erasing his identity, he created a void that the human mind cannot resist trying to fill. He created a mystery that invites speculation, investigation, fascination. In his attempt to disappear, he ensured he would be remembered. The Sligo Cemetery occasionally receives visitors who approach his grave. Some leave flowers, others small notes. Rest in peace, whoever you were, say so. You were someone to someone, say others. Your secret is safe, says one that was photographed and shared online. They are gestures of human compassion toward a stranger who perhaps did not want to be remembered at all. These visitors come from everywhere. Yeah, some are locals from Sligo who feel connected to the story because it happened in their town. Others are tourists who have heard about the case and feel curious. Some are people who have experienced their own losses and find something moving in the story of a man who died alone. And some are amateur investigators who still hope, against all logic, to find a clue that everyone else missed. But perhaps that is precisely the point. That even when someone does everything possible to disappear, something remains. A grave, a blurry photograph on a security camera, a record at a hotel, a false name that becomes the only name we have. Peter Bergman, if that was his name, accomplished what he set out to do. He died without revealing his identity. He died without leaving a trace of his past. He died without anyone really knowing who he was. But he did not manage to prevent us from wondering. And as long as the grave remains there, as long as the story continues to be told, as long as the mystery remains unsolved in some strange and melancholic way, he will continue to exist. Not as Peter Bergman. That name was a fiction from the beginning, a temporary marker chosen perhaps for its generic nature, for its ability to belong to anyone and no one. Not even as a real name, we do not know. Because without that name, without that connection to a lived life, it is difficult to conceive of him as a complete person. But as a question about identity and anonymity, a question about what it means to exist in the modern world, a question about whether it is possible or desirable to live a life so private that not even death can reveal it, a question about what led a human being to make the decisions he made, to walk the path he walked, to end up alone on an Irish beach without name or history, a question that will never be answered. And perhaps there is a certain tragic beauty in that. In a world where everything is explained, documented, archived, where every mystery is eventually solved with enough technology and determination, Peter Bergman represents something that resists that narrative. He represents the unsolvable mystery, the perfect secret, the unanswered question. He represents the possibility, terrifying and fascinating at the same time, that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. That some people take their secrets to the grave. That some stories will never have a satisfying ending. And in the grave in Sligo, beneath a headstone with a false name and a real date of death, rests a man whom no one knows. A man who may have been a retired spy, or a repentant criminal, or simply a lonely soul who chose to die on his own terms. A man who might have had a family who loved him, or enemies who searched for him, or neither. A man who perhaps fled from a terrible past, or who simply wanted a quiet end away from any human connection. A man who took his true identity, his true reasons, his true story, to the cold Atlantic. And there they remain, at the bottom of the ocean, along with so many other secrets that the sea never reveals. Peter Bergman, whoever you were, rest in peace. Your secret is safe.